I remember the season when everything in my life felt quiet on the surface and restless underneath. It was the beginning of the long dry months in Malabo when the sea breeze moves slowly through the streets and the afternoons stretch endlessly under the pale sun. At that time my husband had already left for the northern mining region where he supervised heavy equipment for a foreign company. His contracts always lasted many weeks and sometimes months. When he first accepted that work, we told ourselves it would only be temporary, only until we saved enough money to buy a larger house and build a stable future. But temporary arrangements have a way of stretching into years. When he left that year, he promised he would return in 2 months. 2 months sounded short when he said it standing at the airport entrance with his travel bag over his shoulder. We kissed goodbye and I told him to be careful in the mountains where the mines cut through the earth like deep wounds. At that moment our marriage felt strong and ordinary. We had been together for several years and our life was comfortable even if it was sometimes quiet. I worked in the Ministry of Tourism in an office that organized international visits and cultural events. My days were filled with paperwork, phone calls, and long meetings about hotel development and coastal projects. His work was harder and more physical, but it paid well. When the plane carried him north, the city felt strangely empty even though nothing around me had changed. I continued going to the office each morning, walking past the government buildings with their white walls and tall windows that reflected the bright light of the island sky. Inside the ministry the air smelled faintly of paper and old wood. My desk faced a corridor where people moved constantly between departments carrying folders and documents. It was an ordinary environment, yet during those months of his absence I began to notice how quiet my personal life had become. Loneliness does not arrive suddenly. It grows slowly in small spaces between routines. In the evenings I returned to the apartment and cooked dinner for one person instead of two. I watched television for a while or read reports from work that I had brought home. The nights were long and the apartment echoed with silence. Sometimes I stood on the balcony looking over the city lights and wondering how far away the mining camps were from the ocean wind that moved through Malabo. It was during those quiet weeks that I began seeing him more often at the ministry. His name was Baltesar. He was not part of our department, but everyone in the building knew who he was. He worked with the National Financial Investigation Agency and his office was located in another government complex nearby, yet he visited our ministry frequently because tourism projects often involve large investments and financial oversight. He was a man who carried an air of authority even when he walked casually through a hallway. People lowered their voices when he passed because they respected the seriousness of his work. The first time I spoke with him directly was during a meeting about a coastal development project. Several officials from different agencies gathered around a long table covered with documents and maps. I was responsible for presenting the tourism statistics and visitor forecasts. When the meeting ended, many people left quickly, but Baltesar remained near the table studying the maps carefully. As I gathered my papers, he approached and thanked me for the clarity of my presentation. His voice was calm and deep and he spoke slowly as if he measured every word. I remember feeling slightly nervous because I was not used to speaking privately with someone whose position carried so much influence. But he smiled in a way that removed the tension. We spoke for only a few minutes that day about the growth of tourism in the region and the importance of protecting natural landscapes while building new hotels. After that meeting our paths began crossing more often. Sometimes he appeared in the corridor while I was carrying documents to another office. Other times he joined discussions about investment approvals. Each time we exchanged polite greetings that gradually became longer conversations. He asked thoughtful questions about my work and seemed genuinely interested in the cultural projects our ministry was planning. What surprised me most was the way he listened. Many officials in government meetings speak loudly and confidently but rarely pay attention to the ideas of others. Baltesar was different. When someone explained a project, he leaned slightly forward and watched them carefully as if trying to understand every detail. During those weeks my husband remained far away in the northern mountains. Our phone calls were brief because the signal in the mining region was unreliable. He often sounded tired when we spoke late at night. The work there was difficult and the days were long. Meanwhile, my daily life in Malabo continued, moving around the ministry offices where Baltasar sometimes appeared unexpectedly. Gradually, our conversations became more personal. One afternoon we stood together near the window overlooking the harbor while waiting for a meeting to begin. The sunlight reflected across the water and filled the room with warm light. He asked whether I enjoyed working in tourism or if I had once dreamed of another career. I told him about my love for travel and how I studied hospitality management when I was younger. That conversation lasted only 10 minutes, but afterward I found myself thinking about it more than I expected. There was something calm and thoughtful in the way he spoke that made even simple topics feel meaningful. Weeks passed. The dry season deepened and the air over the island grew warmer. My husband sent occasional messages from the mining camp saying the work was progressing slowly. He promised again that he would return soon. During that same period, my interactions with Baltasar continued increasing through ordinary professional situations. Sometimes we shared coffee in the ministry cafeteria after meetings. Sometimes we walked together through the courtyard discussing tourism plans for coastal villages. Nothing inappropriate happened. Yet an invisible tension slowly formed between curiosity and restraint. I knew I was a married woman. I also knew he was a powerful official whose life was complicated by responsibility and public attention. Still, there are moments when emotional connection grows quietly beneath the surface of everyday interactions. One evening, the ministry organized a small reception for international visitors exploring investment opportunities. The event took place in a hotel near the sea where music played softly and people moved between tables with glasses of wine. I attended because part of my work involved greeting the foreign delegates. To my surprise, Baltasar was there as well. When he noticed me across the room, he smiled and walked over. The atmosphere of the reception felt different from the formal environment of government offices. Without the pressure of meetings, we spoke more freely about ordinary things such as books, travel, and the beauty of the island coastline at sunset. As the evening progressed, I realized how easily our conversation flowed. We laughed about small cultural misunderstandings that sometimes happen when international investors arrive expecting certain stereotypes about Africa. He shared stories about his childhood near the mainland coast where fishing villages wake before sunrise. At one moment we stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking the dark ocean. The sound of waves moved gently against the rocks below. The warm night air carried the smell of salt and distant rain. Standing there, I felt a strange mixture of comfort and unease. Comfort because our conversation felt natural. Unease because I was aware of the growing closeness between us while my husband remained hundreds of kilometers away in the mining camps. Nothing dramatic happened that night. Eventually the reception ended and we returned to our separate lives. But from that evening forward, the emotional line between professional respect and personal interest became more difficult to ignore. Loneliness has a way of amplifying connections that might otherwise remain small. During the long weeks of my husband's absence, the quiet evenings in the apartment gave me too much time to think about the conversations I had during the day. Sometimes I wondered whether Baltasar thought about them as well. When people speak about temptation, they often imagine sudden dramatic moments. In reality, it usually grows slowly through ordinary encounters and unspoken thoughts. By the time the second month of my husband's absence arrived, I could feel the weight of that quiet emotional tension whenever Baltasar entered a room. Neither of us spoke about it directly. We continued behaving professionally and respectfully, yet inside my thoughts a question had begun forming that I did not know how to answer. How easily can a lonely heart begin drifting toward someone who simply understands how to listen? That question stayed with me as the weeks moved forward and the dry season sun continued shining over the city of Malabo while the mountains of the northern province held my husband far away from the life that continued quietly without him. After that evening by the ocean terrace, something changed between us, though neither of us spoke about it directly. The next morning when I walked into the ministry building, the air inside felt the same as always, the same echo of footsteps along the long corridors, the same rustle of papers moving from one office to another, the same voices discussing budgets and development projects. Yet beneath those ordinary sounds I carried a quiet awareness that the world around me had shifted slightly. I knew that somewhere in the building or perhaps in another government office across the street was a man whose presence had begun to move through my thoughts more often than I wanted to admit. For several days we did not see each other. Meetings continued, reports were written, and the slow rhythm of government work filled the hours from morning until late afternoon. During that time I tried to return my focus completely to my responsibilities. Whenever I caught myself remembering the conversation we had shared beside the ocean, I pushed the thought away and reminded myself of the life I had already built with my husband. Still the memory returned quietly like a soft voice in the background of my mind. The next time I saw Baltesa, it happened unexpectedly. I had just left a conference room after presenting tourism numbers to a visiting delegation. As I walked down the corridor carrying my folder, I noticed him standing near one of the tall windows at the end of the hall. The afternoon sun behind him filled the space with warm light, and for a moment he looked almost like a silhouette against the brightness. When he saw me, he nodded slightly and smiled in the calm, respectful way he always did. We exchanged a few ordinary words about the meeting that had just finished, but as we spoke I felt the same quiet tension that had begun forming during the reception near the ocean. It was not dramatic or obvious. It was simply a feeling that our conversations carried a deeper current beneath the surface of professional politeness. Over the following weeks, our encounters began happening in places that felt strangely private, even though we were inside busy government buildings. Sometimes we spoke for a few minutes beside the courtyard fountain where employees rarely stopped because they were always moving quickly between offices. Other times we stood near the stairwell where voices echoed softly against the walls, but no one remained long enough to notice two people talking quietly. Those small moments were never planned. They simply appeared within the rhythm of our daily routines. Yet each time we met there was a sense that both of us were aware of the growing connection but were careful not to name it aloud. What made the situation even more complicated was the contrast between his public role and the quiet kindness he showed in private conversation. In meetings, Baltesa carried the firm confidence of someone used to making serious decisions. His voice remained steady and measured when discussing financial oversight or the responsibilities of government agencies. People listened carefully when he spoke because they knew his position involved great authority, but when we stood together in a quiet corner of the courtyard or near the back of a conference hall, he seemed different. His tone softened and he asked questions about my day in a way that felt personal rather than official. Sometimes he shared small reflections about the pressures of leadership and how difficult it can be to balance responsibility with personal peace. One afternoon stands clearly in my memory. I had stayed late at the ministry finishing documents related to a coastal resort proposal. Most of the employees had already gone home and the building felt unusually silent. As I walked toward the exit, I noticed Baltesa sitting alone on a bench in the courtyard reviewing a stack of papers. When he looked up and saw me, he greeted me warmly and asked if the long work day had finally ended. Instead of leaving immediately, we sat there for a few minutes talking while the evening light slowly faded across the garden. The air carried the faint smell of flowers from the trees that lined the courtyard walls. During that conversation, he spoke more openly than before about the weight of his responsibilities. He explained that leading a financial investigation agency required constant vigilance because corruption and misuse of funds could damage the future of the country if left unchecked. Listening to him, I realized how much pressure he carried every day. His calm public image hid the reality that many powerful interests probably disliked the work he was doing. Things went wrong. The first sign that our carefully guarded secret might not remain hidden came in a way I never expected. I had always believed that within the walls of the Ministry of Tourism, where my workdays stretched long and involved endless paperwork and public event planning, my personal life could remain private. The quiet corners where I had shared small conversations with Baltesa, the walks through the courtyard, the soft exchanges in stairwells and garden paths, all of it had felt invisible to the world outside. The temporary intimacy between two people. Yet human lives are rarely as contained as we believe, and secrecy has a fragile strength that can be broken by even a small crack of observation or careless words. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I noticed the first unusual glance from one of my workmates, Rosa, a young woman who had joined the office 6 months earlier. She often stayed late after meetings to assist with document preparation and sometimes lingered near my desk with questions about project numbers or guest schedules. At first I thought nothing of her curiosity. Government offices are filled with people who ask too many questions about ordinary matters. But over the weeks I began noticing small hints that her interest went beyond professional concern. Her questions about my late arrivals, my brief absences during lunch hours, and my conversations outside regular office meetings seemed increasingly pointed. Each time I answered politely and redirected the conversation to ministry work, she would nod with a smile that now, in hindsight, seemed calculating rather than friendly. The turning point came unexpectedly one evening when my husband called from the northern province. His voice was tired from weeks of early mornings and long work days in the mining camps, yet he sounded unusually tense, almost urgent. He asked questions about my activities, my schedule, and the names of the people I met at the ministry. At first I tried to laugh it off, attributing his concern to distance and his anxiety about work. But the questions kept coming, and there was an undercurrent of suspicion I had never heard in his voice before. It did not take long for me to realize that someone had spoken to him about me, had painted a picture of events that I had believed remained hidden. The voice on the phone carried a subtle accusation and disappointment that tightened my chest with guilt and fear. I learned soon after that Rosa had spoken to my husband. She claimed to have noticed the way I lingered with Baltasar, how our conversation seemed too attentive, too private, and she told him everything she had observed during those months. Every quiet corner, every brief exchange, every late-night conversation that had seemed harmless now appeared, in the retelling, as evidence of betrayal. My husband, thousands of kilometers away, had only pieces of my world to interpret, and the carefully chosen words of a workmate who was only partly aware of the full truth became the lens through which he saw my actions. By the time I received his first angry message, I knew that my private world had collapsed. In the following days, the tension between us grew unbearable. My husband returned to Malabo sooner than expected, citing a sudden issue with one of the mining sites, but I knew the truth. He returned not only because of work, but because the narrative of my betrayal had reached him, and he needed to confront it. When he arrived, our home felt different. The small apartment that had once held quiet routines now carried an invisible weight of anger, hurt, and mistrust. Conversations that had once been light and ordinary now felt charged. Even the simplest exchange, a question about dinner plans or a message left on the kitchen counter, carried the potential for misinterpretation. The first confrontation came the evening of his arrival. He entered the apartment with a heavy silence behind him, dropping his travel bag by the door, and immediately asked questions about my work hours, my interactions at the ministry, and whether I had been completely truthful during his absence. I tried to respond calmly, choosing words carefully so as not to inflame a situation already fueled by suspicion. But the more I explained, the more he seemed to hear only fragments, only pieces, and every word I offered seemed to be filtered through the lens of the story Rosa had told. I felt frustration and sorrow twisting together, a feeling of helplessness that comes when one knows the truth but cannot convince another person of its complexity. In those weeks, our interactions became a fragile negotiation of space and communication. He would ask where I was going, whom I would meet, and what I intended to do at every step. I tried to reassure him with calm explanations, yet his suspicion only deepened with every answer. I began noticing how the warmth and connection that had existed in our marriage slowly eroded under the constant pressure of mistrust. Even ordinary moments, like sharing a meal or watching the television in the evening, felt strained. My heart, which had once been full of shared laughter and mutual understanding, now carried anxiety and a quiet sadness that seemed impossible to alleviate. At the same time, my professional life at the ministry continued. Balthasar remained present in the background, carrying out his official duties as if nothing had changed. Yet our earlier quiet exchanges had to stop. I could no longer speak freely, and the courtyard walks and terrace conversations ceased entirely. His presence became a reminder of both what had been and what could never again exist without consequence. I understood that nothing I could do would restore the trust that had been fractured, and the emotional distance between my husband and me grew with each passing day. The breaking point came several weeks later. Arguments erupted over the smallest perceived transgressions, fueled by weeks of accumulated suspicion and hurt. My husband spoke of betrayal, of the time I had spent in ways that seemed secretive, and of the influence of people outside our marriage. I tried to explain, to clarify the nuances of what had occurred, but in the storm of anger and disappointment, my words were lost. He had already begun to rebuild a narrative where my actions represented intentional harm rather than human error, human curiosity, and the isolation he had imposed through months of absence. In the end, the divorce became inevitable. We spent long, painful evenings with lawyers and mediators, discussing finances, property, and arrangements that had once seemed trivial but now carried the weight of final separation. Every document, every signature, felt like a further step away from the life we had shared for years. I walked through the apartment one final time before leaving it under the terms of the settlement, noticing the corners where I had once laughed, the balcony where I had waited for his return, and the kitchen where meals had been shared. Each space now held the ghost of a life that could not continue. The emotional scars of mistrust, secrecy, and betrayal were etched into every corner. Even after the divorce, the echoes of those months continued to shape me. I felt the bitter weight of loneliness magnified by loss, the sorrow of having my private life exposed and misinterpreted, and the ache of knowing that a marriage I had once cherished could dissolve not from absence alone but from the fragile threads of communication and human error. The Ministry of Tourism remained my professional home, yet every meeting, every hallway exchange, carried memories of hidden conversations and quiet tension that could never be entirely forgotten. In reflection, those months revealed the delicate balance of trust, honesty, and human curiosity. They showed how easily a single observation, a single retold story, could unravel a life built over years. They reminded me that love and intimacy require both presence and clarity, and that distance, whether physical, emotional, or informational, can create fissures that even the deepest affection cannot always bridge. And though the emotional wounds remained, I carried forward a cautious understanding of human relationships, of the fragile nature of trust, and of the painful consequences that arise when the heart and mind encounter misunderstanding, secrecy, and betrayal.